Hello and welcome to the EDHRECast, where we're all about Commander, data, and dad jokes. I'm Joey Schultz, and I'm joined by my fantastic co-hosts. First, he puts the bud in budget. It's Matt Morgan.
My partner told me that she thinks that we'd get in less arguments if I weren't so pedantic about things. And I said, I think you mean fewer arguments, actually.
Which led
to another argument.
Okay.
It was not.
All right. Up next, he thought the word budget meant that his bud was going to go get something for him. It's Dana Roach.
I'm really hoping in 2025 we get our first snow creature that's also a vampire on a card, just so it can have the keyword frostbite.
I don't know. That's no joke.
Hopefully not first strike either.
Wow. All right, guys. Well, hey, Matt, what are we talking about in this week's episode, the last episode of 2024?
Well, we are going to wrap up this year. We're going to do a quick budget overview of 2024. There were a lot of good budget cards out there, budget commanders even. So we want to give a quick second to shout them out before we wrap up 2024.
Heck yeah. Best budget cards of the year. There were some real gems. I'm excited to talk about this one with you guys. But we got some stuff to shout out before we get into it.
This show is being brought to you by Cardsphere.com, our favorite way to turn unplayed Magic cards into played Magic cards. You just add money to your Cardsphere account either by sending out cards or by depositing it like you would in any other account, and people will send you cards at the price you pick using the money in your Cardsphere account. Just click on the link in the video description in the show notes below to check them out at Cardsphere.com. And remember what Santa said on Christmas. All my reindeer love Cardsphere.
These slogans are getting so weird, Dana, but I love that you keep the rhymes.
I've committed to the bit.
And if you would like to support the show, you can do so in a lot of different ways, whether it's subscribing on your local podcast app, subscribing on YouTube. It is such a huge, huge thing. And we know that a lot of you are watching the show but aren't actually subscribed. So you should definitely fix that. Hit the subscribe button. It helps us more than you know. But if you are so moved, you can go to patreon.com/EDHRECast. We have patron tiers of all sorts of levels. Whether you want to join our patron community over on Discord, you want to see all of the historic challenge of stats picks we've been doing over the course of almost 350 episodes. There's all that and more over at patreon.com/EDHRECast, including the weekly patron shout out. So this week, we are going to give the most coveted shout out to Jeremiah Nonis, who said, I don't take no for an answer and no nonsense either. And went to patreon.com/EDHRECast, signed up. Jeremiah, you are an absolute rock star. Thank you so much for all of your support.
Dana, I thought that your slogans were getting out of pocket, but Matt's actually the most unhinged when it comes to
Right, yeah,
They're getting really bad. And going into 2025, I don't think there's any hope for an upturn either.
You have to admit, once we find a bit, we're committed to it. We stick with that bit.
We commit. If there's one thing we do, it's commit.
Well, thank you, Jeremiah, for your support. So, guys, let's get into our talk here about the best budget cards of 2024. And I actually want to start us off with some data, not just about individual budget cards, but actually some budget commanders. And here, I'm not talking about commanders that are monetarily cheap to acquire. I want to talk about the price of decks. So before we can get into the actual commanders that are the cheapest to build according to the data that we've all accumulated on EDHREC, all these commanders that we've got access to, I want to ask you first, what do you think is the average price of a commander deck in the world of Commander right now? Like, Dana, do you have a guess of what the average price of a deck usually is?
People always seem to underestimate what their deck costs, in my experience. They tend to be higher than people seem to think their decks are. I'm going to guess the average commander deck is around $250, if not more. I'm going to say that on the low end, $250.
Oh, I'm
okay.
I'm willing to bet it's way more than that. When we looked at this a while back, I want to say the average deck was in the $350 range. I think it's only gone up since then, just with reprints making things easier to get a hold of. There's a lot of value in pre-constructed decks these days, which makes it pretty easy to have fairly valuable decks. I'm going to guess I'm going to shoot high, $600.
Matt's math is a little bit better here. The average price of decks is roughly $690.78.
Wow.
Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah.
Okay.
Dana, your guess there, closer to the 200 range, is kind of where we'll end up seeing some of the budget commanders of this year fall close to, actually.
Sure.
And that probably still sounds high to a lot of players out there, but it is probably important to consider that even precons release with reprint values somewhere in the hundreds of dollars. Like the Bellow precon of this past year was $147 of just reprint value. And that's not even counting the new cards that precon gave us, So that's an important thing to note about the relativity of budget pricing. But more importantly, we got to acknowledge how this $690 figure is 100% influenced by all the expensive cards like Moxen and Dual Lands and such that are especially common in the competitive end of the format, which of course could also involve a lot of proxying. Those figures don't necessarily represent how much people are truly spending money-wise.
Yeah.
So that figure is actually quite complex. But for what we're actually able to track within our data, yeah, those $1,000 prices are definitely tugging up the mean average that we just listed there. So I think it's better for us to use the median average here, which is $499.87. And the mode average is also $500.
Dang.
That's a little more useful and a practical figure for the typical player there, I think. And Matt, as it turns out, it's still a little bit closer to your guess there.
But I mean, I've noticed that in my own deck building processes, though, too, is when I'm putting stuff together, even an early sketch of a deck without like an optimized mana base, even, it's probably north of $400 these days, just with, you throw in a few of those staples, a few expensive cards.
Yeah.
Plus you have 100 cards to fill in. I mean, Dana has 100 cards to fill in. I have like 85 because I play basics and Dana doesn't, but still.
Right.
The point still remains.
That's a good point.
Yeah, Dana, this number is your fault.
Right. I mean, looking at my deck prices, yes, it's not, I contribute to this problem.
I mean, we each definitely have decks all over the price spectrum for sure. Yeah. And I think it's also wild to look at a number like this, like that's the average price of a deck, and then look at your own roster and be like, dang, I have 10 of these?
Yeah.
But there is a lot of nuance behind that number, right? Because Matt, you're absolutely right that a few individual pieces really affects things a whole bunch, as we saw very often on like our Upping the Average Deck Help YouTube series. Very often you could make a deck fall under $100 by just removing like 4 or 5 cards from their average list.
Yeah.
A deck has a price tag of $150, but then you take the Teferi's Protection out of it, and then suddenly the deck is only $108. Or you take out a single Demonic Tutor from a list, and then the price drops by $42. And as we definitely all know, the biggest budget culprit is usually the land base of your decks too. Like take a close look at the land base and you can save a lot of money by prioritizing budget in that area first and foremost. And prices fluctuate all the ding dang time. A lot of us bought cards when they were only $1 or $2, and then after 3 or 4 years of them not getting any reprints, those cards are now $30-$40. That's pretty common, and that will drive up the average price figure that we're seeing here. It drags it up a lot, even though we ourselves as players didn't actually necessarily physically pay that exact price tag. It was just price accumulating over time. So there's a lot that goes into big figures like the median average of a deck being $500.
Yeah.
Even though that figure probably sounds kind of wild just at a first glance. So yeah, that's a lot of setting the groundwork, a lot of context for us going forward. And now with that out of the way, let's get into the most budget-friendly commanders that were released this year. And it's important for us to note that we mean here not just that the commander card itself is an inexpensive piece of cardboard, but rather that their average deck price is the lowest of the commanders that we got this year. And Matt, I think you'll be happy to know that the number one most budget-friendly commander of 2024 was in your favorite colors, a Selesnya commander, Miriam Herd Whisperer from Outlaws of Thunder Junction.
I mean, people love building budget decks and having an effective budget deck. I'm all about that. So yeah, Miriam Herd Whisperer is the Selesnya human druid from Outlaws at Thunder Junction, a 3/2, and says as long as it's your turn, mounts and vehicles you control have hexproof, and then whenever a mount or vehicle you control attacks, you put a +1/+1 counter on it. So mounts were the new thing that came out in Outlaws at Thunder Junction, not too far off from having a vehicle type of mechanic there. You can tap creatures to activate them, give them some sort of upside and bonus, and having a Selesnya commander to accommodate that makes them easier to protect. That's such a huge thing, is giving mounts and vehicles hexproof, because it's so often easy to get blown out. You tap some creatures to activate a vehicle, but then it gets killed in it right away and you kind of lose your combat step. Miriam does a great job at protecting those from getting blown out. So I love seeing this.
And her average price is usually about $193 per deck, but like a full third of her decks in the database are under $100. So vehicles and mounts are kind of sidelined. They're not like a mainstream mechanic a little bit. So it makes a lot of sense why this would be the kind of thing that you can build pretty easily without having to devote a ton of money into it, even when you're doing bigger upgrades.
Well, in mounts and vehicles are also cards that like, there isn't that one or two really big expensive ones that like, oh, I really want this one dragon in my dragon deck, but it's a, $30 dragon, but it's so powerful I want it. Or, Consecrated Sphinx in a Sphinx deck or something. Like decks that are asking for a specific theme, there tends to be once in a while some cards that like you really want for that deck that are pricey. That's vehicles and mounts just don't necessarily have that. You can probably populate this deck with, 30 different vehicles and spend less than $1 on every single one of them that's in the deck.
Yeah, I mean, when you consider some of the most played vehicles, even Parhelion 2, which was kind of the scourge of some arena formats for a little bit, it's only 50 cents. Yeah. It's a super powerful card, but it's only 50 cents.
Now, interestingly, Miriam is an uncommon commander from Outlaws of Thunder Junction, and that's actually also true of two of the other most budget-friendly commanders that we saw this year, Doc Arlock, Grizzled Genius, and Crown Violent Cacophony. Also uncommon commanders from OTJ, and also among the top 5 most budget-friendly commanders that we got from 2024. Doc Arlock's average price of his deck is about $281, definitely a big jump up from Miriam being under $200 on average, and Crown is also about $282 on average. However, when we're looking at just some percentile stuff, more than half of their decks end up being under like $160 threshold. And for someone like Crown, nearly half of his decks end up being under $100 total. So those are some other interesting standouts. There's something going on with OTJ, and especially those uncommon commanders, that we're letting people tap into some pretty easy budget-friendly builds.
Yeah, it's wild to me seeing that Crown Violent Cacophony, the average deck price is $282, which is that's a fair price. It's a lot more than Miriam. But when 44% of the decks are under $100, that's a huge, huge number. That's one of the most built budget commanders. But then also you see that the average is significantly high. So people are either building it on a hyper budget or they're taking it all the way, which is kind of funny to me to see.
Yeah, it's really interesting. We went from Miriam that was a real specific deck, and like I very clearly understood why that was attractive to people that are building on a budget. And then something like Crom that like nothing about that cries out to me that this would be such a heavily played budget commander.
Well, and those are just some commanders from Outlaws of Thunder Junction. Another interesting stripe of commanders happens here that are also very budget-friendly, specifically from Murders at Karlov Manor. Tessic Judas Hellhound has an average price of about $263. Yaris, Roar of the Old Gods, that's a face-down Gruul commander doing weird stuff from MKM with the disguise mechanic, average price of $284. And also the Goad Precon, Nelly Borka, that commander, has an average price of about $300 or so. And those are some other budget standouts from the year. Now, $300 probably sounds like a whole lot. And it is, but compared to the average we saw at the top of the episode, these are actually still shooting underneath that range, and those are some of the other most common budget-built commanders of this year.
Yeah, $300 for a deck is still pretty pricey out there. And so it's really hard, but we just had to go with what we see from the data as what typically is going to be built the most. So this is the most scientific we could get with the numbers that we're seeing. But yeah, it is hard, and I think it's fairly easy to say we can just draw a line to say like $1 per card that we're going to talk about here moving forward. It's kind of a rough, kind of agreed upon by the community budget type of guideline and a hard number.
Do you guys have any guesses on why these particular strategies might end up being some of the more budget-friendly strategies of the year?
I would say for Tessic and Yaris both, they're playing with a fairly narrow card pool. Yaris, Roar of the Old Gods, especially doing with face-down stuff. We didn't really get a whole lot of face-down stuff outside of Murders at Karlov Manor, where it ended up being, you're playing a lot of draft chaff, basically, in a Yaris deck, at least if you wanted to play in with what the commander's trying to do. Same a little bit with Tessic, Judas Hellhound. You're playing with dogs, and there aren't a lot of dogs out there, and a lot of them are commons and uncommons. So if you're playing along the themes of what the commander's trying to do, it's just because you're playing so much draft chaff that is going to drive down the price.
Yeah, and I think Nelly Borka, if you're looking to build a Boros deck, first of all, the commander itself isn't terribly expensive, but it's got the things that Boros is hurting for a little bit. Card draw, it's got some protection baked in terms of protecting you by goading your opponent's creatures. So like if you were looking to build a budget Boros deck, it solves some of your problems right there on the commander without forcing you to buy a bunch of otherwise expensive cards to like make the deck have a fighting chance against, color combinations and have way more card draw.
Yeah, of the ones we've mentioned so far, Nelly Borka I think is the most interesting because while her average price is lower amongst all of the possible commander options that came out this year. Only 5% of her decks are actually built hyper budget. Only 5% of her decks tend to be under $100. So her average price is closer to that 300x compared to some of the other commanders that might have a hyper budget and a really big budget, with people going either like, super low or super high, which then averages out to a number. Nelly Borka actually does tend to be pretty much more straight line, like streamlined right there in the middle as those decks go, which is kind of an interesting quirk about her specifically. Those were some interesting things that we see. We had a stripe of commanders from OTJ, a stripe from MKM. The cheapest commander on average to build that doesn't have a whole group of them together does, though, end up being Pearl Ear Imperial Advisor from the Modern Horizons 3 set, which is the mono white aura commander that will draw you frankly, an astonishing number of cards with an average price of $302. About a fifth of the decks end up being under $100, and 40% of her decks end up being under $160 threshold, which is really cool to see. Matt, I understand that this is a commander that you're a big, big fan of.
I actually love Pearl Ear. I've seen a couple decks out in the wild, and for being a budget deck, I think they want to say it was like $75. It wasn't even $100. That deck went to town. Joe, you pointed out that like this, it's very easy to draw a whole bunch of cards. Having mono white with equipment and auras, that's nothing new. Drawing a bunch of cards like that, we've seen that a few times. But the cost reduction with giving your enchantment spells affinity for auras, holy cow. It went so hard, so fast. And like there's a lot of just expensive, overcosted, almost draft chaff again type of cards out there. Like Sage's Reverie is 3 and a white, but when it only costs you 1 white, it's absolutely something you want to be casting. That deck went so hard. Oh my God. I can see why this deck would be commonly built on a budget, because it's very, very powerful.
There's 3 different blocks of text on Pearl Ear, and you could probably remove any 2 of them, and it's still a fine commander.
Yeah, a very, very good card. So that's one of your favorite commanders of the year to build on a budget there, Matt. I mean, we went over some numbers about like what shows as the most common or the most easily built on a budget relative to the rest of the year. But I want to linger on some of those favorites. These are some of the things that the numbers are telling us. But for us personally, which commanders draw our attention the most that we think are the most fun to build budget-wise?
I think that this came up 6 months ago in a show for something, but like I've seen a couple of different Ezram Agency Chief decks that were really fun to play against. It's a very cheap commander. You can build it very cheaply. It's from the Murders at Karlov Manor. Eventually, I will get that right, but it might take me several more years.
We'll get it right in 2025, Dana. We'll get it right next year.
When it ETBs, you investigate twice, and you can sacrifice an artifact to give it your choice of Vigilance, Lifelink, Hexproof till end of turn. It's a 5/5 beater in the air. There's just like a lot of different ways you can brew that cheaply. It's just I think, pretty effective and cool commander, and every deck I've seen with it has been fun to play against. And I'll just like it as a budget commander and in one that just is really open-ended.
Heck yeah.
Well, I mean, besides Pearl Ear, one commander that I really like that somehow this is still under $1, and I don't know how that happens, is Arna Kennerud Sky Captain. It's the Esper flying lifelink, has ward, but the nutty part is whenever a modified creature you control attacks, double the number of each kind of counter on it. Then for each non-token permanent attached to it, create a token that's a copy of the permanent that's attached to that creature. Basically, you double everything. No matter what it is that's attached to the creature, it gets doubled, whether it's equipments, all sorts of different things, and it gets out of hand really quickly. I've seen several gameplay channels out there playing Arna Kennerud decks, and it accidentally just goes absolutely bonkers. And it's silly to me that this card is under $1 and how cheaply you can build it, because you don't need a lot of good equipment. Yes, the good equipment obviously gets even better, but it makes even budget equipments get pretty dang powerful.
Yeah, when you're using those simple ones, like an all that glitters, 2 all that glitters is just like that's going
2 all that glitters gets all the math.
It's gonna just nuke someone out of the field if you got 2 of them, and that is not an expensive card to use, and it makes really cool cards that much better. Matt, I am with you. That is a fantastic pick. 2 of the ones that caught my attention this year, I actually ended up building one of them, and I might end up building the other. The one that I built was Honest Rutstein, also from OTJ, also an uncommon. There's just something about that set that had the uncommon commanders that are easy to build on a budget. Honest Rutstein is, I think, a little underappreciated this year. A 3-mana 3/2 Golgari. When it hits the field, you get a creature card from your graveyard back to your hand, which doesn't sound all that interesting, but then it gives a creature spell reduction to all of your stuff. They're one less to cast all of your creatures. The rate at which I'm able to double spell in this deck is just wild. I should not be allowed to chain this many creatures together. That is a huge reduction. It almost feels like having an emerald medallion in your command zone, and that's a very, very powerful rate.
Yeah.
And then the other commander that draws my attention that would be really, really fun to build on a budget is Melek Reforged Researcher for similar reasons, because it gives your first instant and sorcery of each turn a 3 mana cost reduction. So then suddenly you're firing off a Mystic Confluence for just 2 mana. And like, I don't know, that sounds fun to me. That sounds really, really cool.
See, what I basically hear Joey saying is, I want to find cheap ways to do things that aren't fair.
Yeah.
If you're paying a cheap price, you're at least cheating. And there's a lot going on there. There's a lot of layers to unpack, Joey.
3 mana Sublime Epiphany, Matt. 3 mana Sublime Epiphany.
That's too much. That's way too much.
One commander that I didn't really look at closely when Foundations came out, or Foundations Jumpstart in this case, until I saw it being played, was Sinette Jelly Drover. 3 and a blue for a human wizard, and when ETBs or dies, you create a 1/1 blue jellyfish token with flying, and creatures you control with flying get +1/+1. It's cheap commander, unlike a lot of them from Foundations Jumpstart. This one's about 40 cents currently. But what's fun about the deck is, number one, it's really difficult to remove, since the entire deck is built for the most part around blinking stuff. So I'm going to go remove Sinette. Oh, Siren's Ruse just came down and blinked it and made a jellyfish in the process, and my removal spell failed. I guess I'll try it again next turn with something else. Oh, Teferi's Time Twist. blink when that, dodge the removal spell, make another jellyfish. Like, it's running a ton of those instant speed blink spells that simultaneously protect your commander and make jellyfish, and they're dirt cheap. They're like 5-cent draft chaff kind of cards. It's a deck filled with absolute garbage that's very interactive and requires you to do a whole bunch of things. It's just a super fun commander. I was very surprised, and it was great to see, and you could build that deck for nothing too.
Well, and I want to give a quick shout out to the last commander that I want to talk about. The Wise Mothman is the number 48 commander in the past 2 years already. It's barely been out, but it's also 70 cents. That to me is kind of wild to think about, that a commander that is this popular has found this much success. A lot of people are building it, and you can definitely build it on a budget. But I want to just shout out that there's just so many awesome budget commanders out there in general that you can be trying out, that there's really is a good time just to, if you want to have a hard reset on your playgroup, say people have had a power arms race in your playgroup, finding some sort of arbitrary budget decision with your entire playgroup in mind. It's just a fun way to do that. And there's just never been more options than there are today with finding a way to have a sub-dollar theme and just doing that. And so, yeah, just want to give people encouragement out there. Just play around with so many of these budget commanders out there.
Yeah, there are so many of these strategies. I think what we're seeing from all this data and how varied all of it is, there are so many strategies that can really be put into overdrive without you having to spend a whole bunch on it. Aristocrats famously does not require a whole lot of really expensive pieces, because it is about the accumulation of all of these little bits all at once. Spellslinger decks can also function that way. And clearly something like an Aura deck with, Matt, you were mentioning Pearl Ear, that can also build and build and build. Or your Anakenarud can double and double and double. And it just becomes about these little bits of accumulation. And I think it kind of ends up being that lesson of a single stick is easy to break, but a bundle of sticks is very difficult to break.
Right.
And I think that's a good mentality to have when you're approaching budget building.
Yep.
And it's really cool to see how varied these strategies are from across the entire year and all the options that 2024 has given us.
Yeah, there's lots of just great commander options out there that we got this year. There's a lot of great budget cards that we also want to talk about that go in the 99. We're going to talk about them in a second, but first we got to get to the last challenge stats of 2024. So let's get into that real quick. We'll get back into some budget cards here in the second half.
Heck yeah. This episode is also brought to you by Archidect, an amazing deck building website with the best playtester in the game. Seriously, give that playtester a look if you haven't already. It's top notch and so intuitive. The way that things can be moved and grouped and copied, and even adding extra counters to all of your stuff is a total cinch. You know you love playtesting before you commit to buying any cards, and Archidect makes that super, super easy. And whenever I'm updating decks, whether I'm importing a whole list of cards or just adding a handful here and there, it is super easy to do, because you can actually drag and drop cards from Scryfall or from EDHREC directly into your deck on Archidect, and they will load into your deck super fast. That is so dang cool. Give archidect.com a look. That's ARCHIDEKT.com. Genuinely my favorite deck building website. Can't recommend it enough.
My first challenge here is for the card Assemble the Players. It's an enchantment for 1 and a white. You may look at the top card of your library at any time, and once per turn, you may cast a creature spell with power 2 or less from the top of your library. This tends to show up in decks that are running kind of weenie effect creatures, but it's currently only in 8 of about 2,100 Zabaz, the Glimmerwasp decks. And why it's really good there is because modular creatures are by default 0/0s, and they come into play with counters on them. There's 21 legal modular creatures for Zabaz decks, and every single one of them is a 0/0 that you can play at the top of your library with Assemble the Players.
Cool.
And if you look at the top 10 most popular non-modular creatures in Zabaz decks in EDHREC, things like Mirror Retriever, Assault Simulacrum, or Esper Sentinel, 9 out of the top 10 most popular ones have power 2 or less, and 17 of the top 20. So if you are playing as a Zabaz style deck, every creature you're playing in that deck is something you can play at the top of your library with a 2-mana Assemble the Players. And it's in, like I said, 8 of 2,100 decks. It should see more play in those lists, absolutely.
That's so slick. I really like that, Dana. All right, I've got our last listener submitted challenge, the stats of the year, last one of 2024. John Walbrin submitted a challenge here for the commander Marneus Calgar, which is the Esper Warhammer commander that draws you a card whenever you make 1 or more tokens. And John points out something hysterically cool with Marneus. Marneus usually only draws you 1 card, even if you make like 5 tokens at the same time. You'll draw a card whenever you make 1 or more tokens. But John points out a very cool interaction with the Investigate mechanic. Various cards like Officious Interrogation or Ethereal Investigator will say to investigate X times, which in practice means that we usually just make that many clue tokens. However, each investigate is a separate action of creating 1 clue token. So if you investigate 3 times, that's 3 triggers for Marneus, which means you draw 3 cards. You don't even need to have your entire deck care about clues. That's just a very terrific rate of card draw. John shared that some of his favorites for his Marneus Calgar deck are cards like Search the Premises, making clues for everything that attacks you, so you'll deter a lot of aggression that way, or Officious Interrogation, where you would make a clue for each creature target player controls, and therefore draw a card for each creature target player controls for just 2 mana. And that card shows up in just 4% of the over 10,000 Marneus Calgar decks out there. And fun fact, speaking of a budget episode, Officious Interrogation is just 18 cents right now. Anyway, John, this is such a cool catch. Thank you so much for this terrific challenge.
Well, I'll wrap us up then with the last challenge of 2024. So one fun thing that I've gotten to do is judge the Architect deck building contests that have been happening every single month. And it's been a lot of fun, but every single month, there's always some synergy, some interaction that blows my mind that it's not more popular. And so this one is going to come from last month's deck building contest, which had a Slinza, the Spiked Stampede deck, which is the new Jumpstart Foundation's commander. It's Gruul that has a cost reduction for your beast spells, has your beast enter with additional +1/+1 counters on it. And then you can have Slinza fight target creatures when beasts enter the battlefield. So a card that I really think is not showing up enough in these Slinza decks is the backbone for a finalist in the deck building contest that we had. Formless Genesis is 2 and a green for a Kindred Sorcery Shapeshifter that has Changeling, which means it's every creature type, and says you create an XX colorless Shapeshifter creature token with Changeling and Death Touch, where X is the number of land cards in your graveyard, and it also has Retrace, where you can discard a land card in addition to paying its other cost to cast it from the graveyard. We all know that I love Retrace. It's a great way to get dead lands that you draw late game, have some sort of use for them by casting things in your graveyard. Formless Genesis, though, benefits from Slinza's cost reduction because it is a beast. It has Changeling, so it benefits from Slinza's cost reduction. It's making beasts that are getting into the battlefield that are bigger, and it's going to trigger the fight clause on Slinza. If you are playing any of the draw spells that most Slinza decks are playing, you're going to be drawing a bunch of cards from your Woodland Liege, which means you're going to have a lot of dead lands that you can't play any turn anyways. What better than to find a late game mana sink for those dead lands you draw than Formless Genesis for a single green mana when you have Slinza out? I love this synergy so much. So thank you so much for Jellybean for submitting that too. But also, I love this. People out there should be playing this way more often.
A buddy of mine just built a Slinza deck, and I gave the same advice to him, Matt.
It's such a wild card.
I hope you will be happy to know he's going to demolish me soon.
It's such a wild interaction. But also, too, like anytime you see a specific cost reduction, look at any of these kindred sorceries, anything with Changeling. I feel like it's something that's not going to show up on Scryfall searches very often, but it's something you always need to keep in the back of your mind for any synergy like that.
Absolutely. Okay, guys, we talked about some of the most budget-friendly or most commonly built on a budget commanders of 2024 and some of our personal favorite legends of the year to build budget-wise or not, just cheap to acquire. But those are just cards in the command zone. Now we got to talk about the 99, our favorite budget cards of the year to go into your decks. This is a hard one because honestly, I think we named a couple of our favorites on our Rifties episode literally just last week. Like I already talked up Fleeting Reflection and Malevolent Rumble, which are like 11 cents and 61 cents respectively. And they're genuinely two of my favorite cards of the entire year. So I don't want to dwell on some of the stuff we've already covered last week. I can't be alone in that, right? Like Dana, I'm sure that you have a lot of picks that feel very similar to this.
Yeah, like Dire Sight and Commune with Evil we talked about, great cards, very budget friendly as well, but we hit on them, so let's not spend much time continuing to talk about them.
Yeah.
The first one I want to mention, and this is the only card that's over $1, and it's just over $1, but it's so good I do want to mention it, is Abstergo Entertainment.
Hey.
It was in the Assassin's Creed set. Joey doesn't like hearing about graveyard destruction, but
hey,
it's another scavenger grounds for your deck. Like, I'm running this on every single one of my decks. I for a just over $1 card that it doesn't have much opportunity cost and can solve a game-winning situation when the graveyard player is doing something degenerate, Joey. It's a great card, and it should be in more decks.
That felt targeted.
That may have been specifically referencing one person.
Your high win percentage on our data episode, looking over our games of the year, it's making a whole lot of sense when you're playing stuff that just nukes my entire strategy. Well done.
They're right. That's why.
Matt, what about you?
Well, one card that actually I love, but again, it's one of the most played cards of the year, so I don't need to tell you all to play Demand Answers. It's very, very good. But two cards that also are in the same vein of just great budget red draw options is Wild Wasteland and Embrace the Unknown. Both of those just fit such a great space in your draw kind of categories you're going to put on your decks. Embrace the Unknown, another card with Retrace, kind of like my challenge this week, where you get to impulse draw a couple cards, or Wild Wasteland, which is kind of just a Phyrexian Arena type of effect for red. To skip your draw step, but you exile the top 2 cards of your library and you can play those every turn. That's just such a great way to crank through your deck and make sure you're getting just a consistent source of card advantage. I absolutely love both of these cards, and they're both under $1. I just think that if you want to give an injection of card draw, which we used to joke and laugh that mono red can't really do any card advantage, that's not the case anymore. There's lots of great budget ways to put that into your decks.
Speaking of red card advantage, connecting the dots. It's a red enchantment for 1 and a red. Whenever a creature you control attacks, exile the top card of your library face down, and then you can spend 1 in a red and discard your hand and sacrifice connecting the dots and put all of those cards into their owner's hand. Like, the amount of times I've seen this put like 15 or 20 cards into somebody's hand is ridiculous. In any kind of a go wide deck that has red, and that's a whole lot of decks. This card is like back-breaking for the 2 mana it costs and the 45 cents you can buy it for.
Yeah, it reminds me of what was the card back from Kaladesh block originally, where whenever that creature attacked, you got to put a card down there and you had to discard your hand to put those cards.
It was a Bomat Courier?
Yeah, Bomat Courier. There we go. Yep. Yeah, Connecting the Dots does a lot of similar things as Bomat Courier does, except this translates a little bit better for Commander because it gets all of your creatures. I really like this. This is a great card, Dana.
I kind of agonized over picking some favorite budgets because there were so many of them. And
fair.
The other thing, too, is that not only did I not want to talk about cards that we'd already mentioned, but I also didn't want to pick cards that are just very, very similar to a bunch of other cards that are already also budget that we have this year. Like a favorite creature of mine this year was Accursed Marauder, which is very similar to the Plague Crafter style of creature that we already have a whole lot of. This one was 2 mana instead of 3. I really like that. I really like the card Escape Tunnel and Evolving Wilds that also can make a tiny creature unblockable. But those are already categories of cards that are pretty budget friendly in the first place. So I think actually some of the cards that ended up catching my attention instead are things like Vile Mutilator. Have y'all had the misfortune of playing against this thing just yet? Because it's a doozy.
I haven't. This sounds like a fake card.
It is a 7-mana demon from Duskmourn. As an additional cost to cast this spell, sacrifice a creature or enchantment. I'm a graveyard player. We don't cast things. We reanimate them. It is a flying trample, and when it hits the field, each opponent sacrifices a non-token enchantment, then sacrifices a non-token creature. This, I think, reads to people as like another version of Dusk Mangler, another one of those cards that you can get back, and the payoff seems a little bit weird. Is it all that good? Especially it's just an uncommon. This is not a Dusk Mangler. This is a 6-for-1, and you can sacrifice it and bring it back, and sacrifice it and bring it back. This card's absolutely wild. It gets rid of enchantments with alarming efficiency. This card's really caught my attention this year, and I've put it into more than 4 decks of mine this year.
Well, yeah, and if you can get a copy for 16 cents out there, then it's definitely worth taking a look at too.
Well, if we're talking about black creatures that get rid of stuff with alarming efficiency, Arcbound Condor is such a good card in so many decks. 2 and double black, flying, modular 3, who cares? What's important about Arcbound Condor is whenever another artifact enters battlefield under your control, target creature an opponent controls gets -1/-1 till end of turn. And there are so many black decks like that are built around making treasures, or built around making clues, or food, or just any kind of like artifact deck or equipment deck. Like this can very easily just accidentally clean up your opponent's boards. Like just take out 2 or 3 creatures per turn, every single turn in a lot of different decks. And it's a, 12-cent card. And it's also a 3/3 flyer for 4 mana. Like that's not nothing either. And it will move those counters onto something else if it dies. It just does all of the things so many decks want to be doing.
Yeah, so terrific. Honestly, Black's removal options this year have given us a lot of very interesting stuff. Dana, I think you probably have some experience, as I do, with the card Come Back Wrong, the Duskmourn rare sorcery that is under $1, where you destroy target creature, but then you'll get it until the end of turn, and then you'll sacrifice it. I think this reads to people as like, a sorcery removal spell. Don't know how much I love that. What it is I will kill your Avenger of Zendikar, and then I will get the tokens from that, and I'm really happy about stealing your Enter the Battlefield effects. The more I've seen this card, the more I feel like I've been underrating it.
Well, the weird note about it, too, is the way the card is worded and written, you can take someone's commander that you kill with it. You get to, before the replacement effect happens, you gain control of it. So even if you're removing a commander, you still get to take it and use its ability for that turn. Super cool card.
Well, Joey, I also want to talk about black cards. So Dana, please let me interject here with one. So if you don't want to pay $8 for Farewell, a card that I saw that actually does an incredible impression of that is Final Act. It does a lot of the same things, and a lot of times in execution, it's going to be a Farewell. 4 black for a sorcery that says choose one or more, destroy all creatures, destroy all planeswalkers, destroy all battles, exile all graveyards, and each opponent loses all counters. This is just such a wild, hard reset on the game. I'm surprised this hasn't gotten more attention because, like I said, it doesn't exile all these things, so there are ways to get around it with Indestructible. But a lot of times you're able to work around that. And if you need a budget replacement, it's, like I said, it's 70 cents. It's super, super cheap right now. If you're playing black and need a Farewell type of effect, Final Act just does all of that.
Speaking of removal spells, Unexplained Absence is one of my other favorite removal spells of the year. 4 and a white instant. For each player, you can get rid of something they have, and you'll cloak the top card of the library. Sort of a mix of Reality Shift and Grasp of Fate. I think this one's really, really cool, and in all of my white decks, it's a really strong consideration every time I'm brewing.
Midnight Snack from Foundations, 2 and a black for an enchantment, and it has Raid. At the beginning of your end step, if you attack with a creature, create a food token. That's really useful in a whole bunch of decks, whether they want to gain life or go wide by making a bunch of artifacts. You're just making a token every turn. However, for 2 and a black, you can sacrifice the enchantment and target opponent loses X life, where X is the amount of life you gained this turn. There's a lot of decks where that just means like kill target player. You make food tokens, and whatever life gain shenanigans you're doing, you do it, and then, oh, by the way, you're dead. Because I just gained 16 life this turn, and bam, you took it to the face. Like, it's such a good card, and it does, again, it's doing not just one thing, but multiple things. It's beneficial to you in a bunch of different decks, even before you get to that point where you just house somebody.
Well, and Dana, I'm attached to this card because it's actually a picture of my kitchen at midnight they turned into a Magic card. That art right there, it hits home in ways that shouldn't because it's too accurate.
Mm-hmm. Well, and this is important too because life gain decks can be famously pretty expensive to build. A lot of the win conditions for life gain decks are kind of costly. So finding budget versions of them is really, really important for decks like this. Matt, you've been indulging us a lot, talking about a lot of aristocracy or necromantic kind of stuff in the color black. Let's move to your colors, a lot of green stuff going on there. There's a pick that just came out in Foundations that I am surprised is only about 49 cents. Have you played with Spinner of Souls yet? The Spider Spirit, 3 mana, 4/3 with reach. Whenever another non-token creature you control dies, you may reveal cards from the top of your library until you reveal a creature card. Put that card into your hand, the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. Really nice insurance as a creature that can do the beatdowns, where if people are going to wipe your board, you'll still end up with some creatures left over. It's evolutionary leap that you don't have to pay for. I've been using this in my green-black Aristocrats deck. With this in play, I cast like a Foundation Breaker. I evoke that, it sacrifices, and then not only do I get the benefit off of that, but also go and draw a card, and then, I've got like a Vein Ripper in my hand. So this has been fueling my Aristocrat engine nonsense, but also I like it as a great beatdown type of card in order to keep your fuel still filled. That way, if someone does wipe the board, you're still able to have cards in your hand and stay in that game and maintain your aggression towards other players if you're playing one of those stompy type of decks. So Spinner of Souls is a really, really cool new card from Foundations that I think should get more love than it currently is, and it's under $1.
Well, speaking of stompy stuff, Fangs of Colonia for Modern Horizons 3, 20 cents right now. Mm-hmm. Put a +1 counter on target creature you control, then double the number of +1 counters on each creature that had a +1 counter put onto it that way. If that was if it just put a counter on a creature and doubled the amount of counters, that is a great card in +1 counter decks. But the fact that you can overload it for 4 and double green and put a +1 counter on every creature you control and then double the counters on them, if you're playing a +1 counters deck or a deck that even has a sub-theme, that is a ridiculously powerful card for, the cost of a piece of gum from a gumball machine. Like, amazing card. And Matt Morgan, you should be playing that in whatever Selesnya deck you have that's using +1 counter stuff.
Well, actually, my +1/+1 counters deck is actually Sultai colored, Dana. But you are right. It's a fantastic card.
Well, there we go.
It's super powerful. Anytime you have an overload spell, I think it's great.
Yeah.
Overload is a super, super powerful mechanic.
So good.
And everybody probably needs to play more of those cards. And speaking of powerful cards, knowledge is power. Quite literally in the name. This is a budget card that I opened on accident because I was opening like some throwaway packs or whatever, and this happened to be in there. I put it into my Council of 4 deck, and it wins games. Oh my goodness. So 3 for 3 in Azorius for an enchantment that says creatures you control get +X/+X, where X is the number of cards you've drawn this turn. So in a deck that I'm just accidentally drawing 3-4 cards per turn, that in itself is just an overrun type of effect. It's so powerful. I was playing some similar cards in my Council of 4 deck, but the fact that knowledge is power is 49 cents and does what I need to do, but it's also just super easy to track. It's also a great defensive tool. It's not a sorcery where it's a one-time pump. Mm-hmm. That is a static thing. So if you're drawing cards on your opponent's turns as well, it is a huge, huge powerful tool for defensive play too. I love Knowledge is Power. And if you need a good bump of power in your decks, definitely check this one out too, because it's super great for 50 cents.
If you've ever seen this card in a Rafine Scheming Seer deck, where when you attack, you connive a whole bunch, you just draw a bunch mid-combat, it's unreal. Honestly, bonus challenge to stats, this card's cracked in a Rafine deck.
It's very good.
And cracked in general. It's
very good in a lot of decks.
It's a really cool card. I love that.
I'm a big fan of the bottomless pool / locker room room combo. Bottomless pool part for 1 blue, you can return up to 1 target creature to its owner's hand, which is, fairly useful. But the locker room half for 4 and a blue, whenever 1 or more creatures you control deals combat damage to a player, draw a card. Sure, there's Coastal Piracy, and there's Biden of Thassa, and there's Reconnaissance Mission, and there's the Indomitable that all draw you cards when a creature you control deals combat damage. And apparently that's not enough, because I also want this in the deck that's running those other cards as well. Like, you just can't have enough of these effects, I feel like, and when it's, 20 cents to buy it, unbeatable.
I'll just shout out one more pick here, also still leaning into some of the Stompies, and that was actually our preview card from the Fallout set, Grim Reaper Sprint. Matt, definitely a favorite of yours too, I think.
Love that perk.
Yeah, a 5 mana enchantment aura in red, but it has Morbid, so it costs 3 less to cast if a creature died this turn. You throw this aura onto a creature, the enchanted creature will get +2/+2 in haste, but when this enchantment hits the field, you untap each creature you control, and if it's your main phase, there's an additional combat phase after this phase. So you attack, potentially something chump blocks, dies, and then for 2 mana you get an extra combat, and you buff up a creature while you're doing it.
It's great. It's great.
70 cents. It's really cool. I don't know what else to say other than this card cool.
You sent people to the grave.
Yeah.
Grim Reaper Sprint is 70 cents, and if you told me it was $5, I'd be like, wow, that's a really good price for that card. I'll take that at $5.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I love this card. In addition to it being our preview card, I loved getting to preview that. It was a lot of fun. It leaves your opponents unable to scream because they're dead. Ironically, the name of the last card I want to shout out real quick, which also is another in a long line of cards that just leave your opponents with a creature that loses all of its abilities. For a single blue mana, you get an aura that says enchanted creature loses all abilities and is a toy artifact creature with base power and toughness 0/2 in addition to its other types. And as long as enchanted creature is face down, it can't be turned up. That doesn't happen very often, but it is nice. But I saw this come down on a mana dork that a person kept a greedy hand, and they just didn't have a way to get rid of this. For a single blue mana, it's such a powerful effect. And yes, your opponents may be able to sacrifice it. It's not indestructible like a Darksteel Mutation might be, but a single blue mana, that's so important, just how cheap it is. Yeah. I've put in a couple decks as a way just to get rid of opponents for a little bit, and yeah, just tie down what their best creature on the battlefield is with activated abilities, static abilities. Just a great card in general, and it's 10 cents.
If Witness Protection can show up in 38,000 decks, which does a similar thing, 1 mana turn it into a legitimate business person, a 1/1. Well, a 1/1 is skull clampable. Right. And when you're unable to scream, you're an O2, so you're not skull clampable. Yep, Matt, I am with you. Yep. This card, I'm eyeing it even more and more for my decks too.
Yeah, add a single blue. Everything about this card is attractive. My last pitch here for budget cards, and there's just so many good ones, we could make this a 4-hour show. But the last one I want to talk about here is Lunar Insight. It's 2 and a blue for a sorcery. Draw a card for each different mana value among non-land permanents you control. I've regularly, cast this for the 3 mana and drawn 2 cards, but I've cast it for the 3 mana and drawn 6 cards before. The floor on it is pretty decent, and the ceiling is way up there. And again, this is a card that you can get for 50 cents or so. Very, very useful, and in a whole lot of blue decks, just a very efficient piece of draw.
And if you play it in one of the commanders I like this year, Melek Reforged Researcher, it'll only cost 1 mana. What a steal.
Right, there we go. Yeah.
Dana, you are right that we could absolutely just go on and on and on these for a really long time. There have been a lot of really cool gems this year to go into the 99 and some really cool commanders capping off the top of decks. It's been a good year all around for us to find some really neat stuff that does not break the bank.
Yeah, it's easy to get caught up in all the flashy, expensive cards, but don't forget, you got to eat your veggies. You got to have some cheap cards in there every now and then, too. Keep your opponents on their toes.
Heck yeah. And so I think that actually means that now we got to turn it over to our listeners. Folks out there, what are your favorite budget commanders and budget cards for the 99 from all of 2024? There are some really excellent picks out there. You got to let us know what your favorites are. And with that, we're going to call this episode to a close. So fellas, if our listeners want to get in touch with us, where is it that they can find us on the onlines? Matt?
So you can find me on pretty much any social media platform at Mathimus55. That's MATHIMUS55. And don't forget, we are going into 2025, but we still want to say one more time, we here believe that Black lives still matter. So going into next year, a lot of things are up in the air. We're with you and we believe in you. So yeah.
And I am Dana Roach. You can find me online at Dana Roach. I'm writing articles for EDHREC and Commander's Herald, and you can find all of us together at patreon.com/EDHRECast.
And I'm Joey Schultz. You can find me everywhere online, from Instagram to Blue Sky at Joseph M. Schultz online. Plus, you can find the cast everywhere at EDHRECast. And if you have a question for us, perhaps a challenge the stat submission, you can contact us at EDHRECast@gmail.com. Listeners, we'll be back at you next year with more data and insights. Matt, let's echo what you said. We always love to add an extra shout out to the end there. And one more thing too is that, Sheldon, we miss you every dang day.
Yeah.
With that, until next time, EDH wreck your deck. Before you wreck your deck, we'll see you next year.